Hello, and welcome to the 56th episode of the Veggies Abroad podcast. I'm your host and chief veggie pusher, Rebecca Gady-Swicky. If you're new around here, Veggies Abroad is a travel company that believes exploration should be a force for good. And for us, that starts with being plant-powered. Every trip we design is guided by compassion for people, animals, and the planet. From custom trip planning and small group adventures to our blog packed with guides, tips, and inspiration. And of course, this podcast. This show is all about shining a light on the businesses, people, and ideas that make travel better. From vegan-friendly experiences to responsible tourism practices and community empowerment, because those are the things we need more of and the things worth supporting when we travel. I am going to jump right into today's episode. It's one of those conversations that I think will stick with you for a long time. I hope really it does stick with you because it's important. We have all seen the photos of cute pigs and puppies and God knows what else in cafe settings, maybe even liked them on social media. But the growth of these cafes is a huge problem for the animals, for the planet, and the people who visit them. I was so glad, well, not glad that she had to write this and that the problem exists, but that I came across the extensive guide highlighting all of these issues associated with these cafes by one of our favorite travel writers, Sooz Shanker. This is actually the second time Sooz has been on the show. She joined us last year to chat about tourism leakage, another really great conversation, and one I promise you will stay with you long after as well. If you didn't listen to it, go back and do it. I think it was around 36 or so. Her research is always super thorough and enlightening, and I hope that she joins us for more educational deep dives on this podcast. Sooz is the founder and editor-in-chief of Curiosity Saves Travel, a travel blog and resource dedicated to sustainability and regenerative tourism. She has over 15 years of experience in the industry, starting as a local Alaska tour guide, and most recently, she's approached tourism with an academic lens, studying the intersection of travel and the natural environment. She has a Master of Science in Biodiversity, and her research specializes in using nature-based solutions to help manage some of tourism's negative impacts. Sooz, thank you so much for joining me again. It is a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, I'm really excited that you invited me back on here, and I'm excited.
Yeah, you always have such great articles. You do a lot of really thoughtful research into things. So every time you post something, I'm always like, oh, what does she have to talk about now? How could this be helpful for other people to learn about? So thank you for putting in all that effort. I know that it is not a small amount of work that goes into some of these things that you do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very flattered. I'm blushing right now if you can't.
Yes, people should know that with the amount of effort that goes into so many of these things. So specifically for the animal cafes, what prompted you to want to investigate them and then create this guide?
Yeah, so growing up, my knowledge of animal cafes was really the more, I guess, generally limited to kind of these more ethical models, the rescue, nonprofit cat cafes. And that's sort of, I thought, the extent of it. But a couple of years ago, I really started noticing, some more questionable experiences appear on social media. So I started seeing people interacting with, micro pigs, raccoons, otters in like this cafe-like setting. So that started to raise a few red flags. And then I went to Japan, and not quite what I appear to be, but I am interested in counterculture. And so I had always wanted to visit the Harajuku neighborhood in Japan. And I sort of had this idea from my teenage years of what it would be like. I have never left somewhere so fast. I think within 15 minutes of arriving, I was hightailing it out of there, just surrounded by these very inhumane captive animal experiences really caught me off guard. I genuinely could not believe what I was seeing. I mean, I did a double take. There was a man that had an Asian small-clawed otter on a chain attached to him in the middle of the street, and they were welcoming you into this otter cafe. There were pig cafes, owl cafes, a hedgehog, small animal cafes, and so many more. And I was really disheartened when I saw a line of people waiting to go to these cafes. And I had one of those moments where I was like, surely everyone else is getting these red flags that I am. What is going on? Why are there so many people eager for this? And these places do really employ very slick marketing tactics. And they do play on animal lovers' desires to be close to animals. And it really is difficult. I looked at some of these ethics washing tactics that they employ, which is when a company, similar to greenwashing, appears to be more ethical than they are. And they employ these, excellent ethics washing tactics. So it really is hard to cut through this and kind of understand like what's going on. So that was sparked my interest. Like I wanted to better educate people. And full disclosure, I have not actually been to some of these more unethical cafes. I determined they were not worth my time or money to even go investigate in person because I got so many red flags from them. I did, however, so just a background, I have a master's in biodiversity, and my thesis actually looked at the intersection of tourism and wildlife. So I kind of utilized my education and I read through peer-reviewed academic articles, policy documents, blog posts, I watched YouTube videos, and I looked through Reddit reviews, Google reviews, TripAdvisor reviews to kind of get a feel, looked through photos to get a feel for what these cafes were like. And yeah, there were actually moments that I had to take a break from writing that article because it was so emotionally triggering for me. I mean, there was tears at one point when I was watching some of these videos. So it's I think a bigger situation than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those what lies beneath kind of topics. It's not just what's happening on the surface. There's so many layers.
You're kind of just really seeing this, what's on top, and there's a lot going on underneath.
Yeah, yes. How did these even become a thing?
Yeah, so, I think they kind of had humble beginnings, I guess, and they were really, they started as an establishment for people who lived in small apartments, maybe that didn't have a no pet policy, or had really intense work schedules, where they could just go interact with domestic animals in a social setting. The first one actually opened, I think, in Taiwan in the late 1990s. And they can be more formal cafe settings where, you sit down and you order a cup of coffee and kind of interact while animals are free roaming around you. Or they can be less formal where you're almost in this like enclosed indoor micro zoo where you're playing or feeding with these animals. But they sort of spread across Asia, I think, because of this like perfect kind of situation where there was a lot of relaxed animal welfare laws and policies. And like I said, these small apartments. And they became increasingly popular. And I think most important for this conversation, they became really profitable. So as this concept expanded, a lot of people were like, wow, we can make a lot of money on this. And we sort of went from these domestic situations with cats and dogs. And they were like, okay, we could actually make a lot more money if we introduce primates, owls, otters, because people are willing to pay more money for that. So as this concept expanded and kind of spread across Asia, we sort of saw this split between these very unethical wild animal experiences and kind of the more like humble beginnings of what they were intended to be.
Wow. It's crazy how one thing can start off so innocently and then like wildfire, it just spreads.
Yeah.
These aren't just a problem in Asia, right?
No, and I tend to focus a little bit on Asia because that is where they started and sort of became popular. But there are, ethical cafes all over the world, cat cafes, and we're starting to see these exotic animal cafe experiences spread as well. So I know there's a capybara cafe in Florida, and the UK just opened one. So these more exotic and wild animal experiences are spreading. And so I hope you can actually take some of these and kind of use the critical thinking skills from this to apply this to any cafe situation anywhere in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's unfortunate now that it's spreading further.
I know.
So if we kind of dive in a little bit deeper into this, very kind of high level, what are some of the biggest ethical concerns with these cafes?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful first to maybe kind of define the types of cafes that we're seeing, and then we can go into a little bit of the ethical stuff. So when looking at these cafes, I talked about there's a little bit more of the formal setting or the less formal setting. And we can split these into two main ways to assess them. So the first one is the business model. So are these cafes operating at a for-profit level, in which case they are primarily looking at making money and the tourist or visitor experience over the welfare and well-being of the animal. So in these situations, these animals are really just products or a commodity. They are stocked like a product and they are expendable, and you just order more animals and they come in and you sort of rotate through them. So this is the for-profit kind of commercialized model. And then the other one is more of a nonprofit, ethical charity where they're rescuing and maybe keeping animals out of the shelter in a safe environment or going through a vetting process where they're trying to rehome them. And the second way to kind of group these cafes is looking at the type of animal that is kept in the cafe. So there are domestic animals, which are cats, dogs, livestock, anything that has been domesticated to kind of live alongside humans. And there's generally a list of domesticated animals that are known. And then you will also see exotic and wild animals. In these cafes, we talked about otters, capybaras, penguins, all sorts of stuff. So as we start to put those together, you can kind of filter through what is slightly more ethical and what is very unethical. So you can have a for-profit domestic cafe, which is like a Shiba Inu cafe or Shiba Inu cafe. And those are unethical because they're focusing primarily on a specific breed and sourcing these for that breed. Then you can have a for-profit, exotic, wild cafe. These are also very unethical. And then you have a not-for-profit rescue cafe that's operating more with domestic animals that are slightly more ethical. So when we're talking about the ethics, it's primarily focused on those for-profit models, whether they have domestic animals or wild animals.
That is a really good distinction. It's kind of like the slippery slope there of problematic cases.
Yeah, and some of these cafes will even house both exotic and domestic animals. So sometimes really just looking at the business model can be the most helpful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And some of those, you mentioned the Shiba Inu, they kind of operate a little bit like pet stores as well, but with coffee.
Yeah. And I was like, if you're not going to go to a pet store in a foreign country, why would you go to this type of experience, right? So,
yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is an excellent point. So some of the ethical concerns, animal abuse, welfare concerns, touch on those.
Yeah, so the three main broad ethical concerns, you just highlighted them, animal abuse and welfare, concerns for human health and zoonotic disease transmission, and then there's implications for biodiversity loss and, animal trade.
Yeah. Those are definitely not things that are in the marketing for these places, for sure.
Yeah.
So some of these cafes, we've talked about it already. They use wording, they use marketing that indicates that they're doing things to protect animal welfare and the well-being. But can you talk a little bit more about some of those key issues about where the disconnect is and how they're presenting themselves one way, but they're not actually doing that?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that ethics washing, right? So some of these cafes are great at these marketing tactics. And, sadly, they are full of animal abuse. And I think some of this is willful negligence and some of it is just sort of unintentional or misguided due to lack of knowledge, resources, or space. So most of these cafes, they really just lack the essential space, nutrition, veterinary team, and facilities to care for some of these animals. I looked at one study that was conducted by some wildlife researchers, and they visited or looked at hundreds of these cafes across Asia, and not a single one had the adequate facility to care for Asian small-clawed otters, which is typically the type of otter you're seeing at these otter cafes. And in terms of the marketing tactics, so companies will say things, we don't force interactions between people and animals. We limit the time that you have with an animal to 30 minutes. Those all sound great. And those are things that also ethical cafes will enforce. But some of these unethical cafes, they will do things like restrict access to food or affection to these animals to encourage interaction, right? So they're not forcing it, but they are basically putting it on the trajectory for that to happen. Or after an animal's 30-minute shift, right, they move them to the back of the house where they may be kept in like cages or small enclosed spaces. So they're kind of using these like very slick marketing tactics. And to briefly go over just how bad the welfare situation is. So there's like malnourishment that's happening at these. So animals are intentionally deprived of food and water. And this is done to reduce the amount that they are relieving themselves in the cafe. So they're defecating less or, urinating less. So it's kind of these intentional things. And also, so they're more excited to be around people. I saw owls chained down to fake trees, foxes chained to huts. The otters are often kept in these very small plexiglass like containers, and they have like little, kiddie slides and a very small pool for them, but they're so small. The animals can't express their natural behavior. They are in a clinical cafe setting that is mostly set up for like the visitor experience and not for the animals. They don't have the social dynamics. Some of the reviews I read were talking about reports of animals fighting. So this was happening at a lot of the pig cafes where the pigs were fighting, bleeding, biting each other, a lot of aggression. Stressful and chaotic environment. So I read one expose on these owl cafes that talked about how the owls were tied down with like loud music and artificial lighting. And if you're an animal that is, evolved over thousands of years to be so good at hearing and night vision, imagine being tied down while loud music is blaring and you're just in this very chaotic environment. So animals are pacing, picking at their ropes, clingy, aggressive behavior. And I read one expose from a ex-owl cafe employee that said the amount of death at those cafes was staggering. And they left and wrote this big article on it. And the cafe owner would not take these sick owls to the vet and instead would just, if they died, they would just, like I said, they kind of treat them like a stock. You order more, you get more, you rinse and repeat. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I read that same article from the ex-owl cafe worker, and I was so sad because these animals, like during the day, they sleep. They're night owls. Hello. The phrase. They're not, party animals that are going to be awake during the day and want to entertain you. And then they cannot move away, which...
it breaks my heart. And I mean, the shape of an owl's face, is designed to, it's almost like a satellite dish where it like funnels sound into their ear. So just like, I can't even imagine, like, it's probably like the equivalent of being in solitary confinement while heavy metal blares, unless you like heavy metal. I don't know. But
I was thinking that exact same thing, actually. Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. Or I was talking with someone, I was probably from World Animal Protection. They were talking about their work with whales and SeaWorld specifically, and that like dolphins and whales, where they use the echolocation and those pools, it can be really challenging because it bounces off and just comes back to them.
Oh my God.
So I have to imagine that's some similar things with the owl, that the owl is constantly being like hit with loud noises, and I have to imagine that at times they lose their hearing after
I'm sure, or I don't know if there's a diagnosis for going mentally insane in those situations. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I would think you would have to. I don't know how you wouldn't. And so, okay, we've touched on the welfare issues, the abuse with the animals. Obviously, that's apparent and terrible and awful. But there are also issues with having exotic animals and humans in confined spaces, and the possibility of spreading disease. Is it really a risk?
Yeah, this was kind of the one that makes sense when you think about it, but I think it was one of the more surprising ones to me. Exotic animals and humans really aren't meant to be in closed, confined interaction spaces, period, right? Unless, especially in this situation where a lot of the staff are not trained to care for exotic animals, which is, unlike some zoos where staff are, highly specialized and trained to be around these animals. These animals are just around regular people, regular staff members. And, I think there's this kind of disconnect where sometimes the animals may look happy or like their needs are being met, but sure, animals like otters or capybaras that are raised from infancy to depend on humans will be very eager to be around humans or very friendly, especially if they're restricted food and water. And they kind of tend to associate people with food, but it doesn't mean they're happy, healthy, or well taken care of. And I think as we start to see these animals that appear to us to look excited to be around us, that starts to change this perception. And I've read some really interesting articles recently about how there's almost this kind of uptick in people wanting to keep raccoons or otters as pets because they see them online and they're like, oh, they're interacting with people. And so these otters are actually, going into homes where people are not adequately equipped to take care of them or have the know-how to take care of them. So it's
people are putting otters in their house.
Yeah. So some of these cafés will even adopt some of these animals out to people. So there's this increase of this. So it's changing our perception of, what a wild animal is. So that's one of the dangers, I think, of interacting so closely with exotic animals. And I think the more, so people are like wanting to keep these at home. And I think even there's this like trend of raccoons too, where people are like, oh, maybe if I attract them and like feed them on my patio, they'll become like familiar with me and they're friendly. A very dangerous, slippery slope.
Yes.
Disease is also a very real issue. So human health and hygiene at these cafes. The cafes go through motions, where they have you wash your hands before you come in, or they have you wash your hands when you leave. So they're kind of presenting this like we care about the health and hygiene. But there is a risk of zoonotic diseases. So I read one report by the WWF Japan and the Hokkaido University, and another paper was published in the Conservation Science and Practice. And they found a high risk of zoonotic Salmonella E. coli, a type of roundworm that can be fatal to humans. And some cafes were also housing primates, which are regulated under the infectious disease control law due to their high risk of human to wildlife transmissible diseases. So there is a risk of this. I don't think there's been any outbreak yet, but the fact that researchers are looking into this, there is a probability that this could happen, and that we could actually end up infected from visiting these places and interacting with these animals.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great point. Before we started chatting, I'd mentioned to you that it was the Humane League had reached out to me, and they were trying to push back on a raccoon cafe in Bali that was doing some heavy Instagram promotion. And so I was doing some digging into it, and I was really surprised at the amount of things that disease-wise can be moved from humans or from raccoons to humans. Hey there, fantastic listeners. Let's hit pause on this episode for a thrilling announcement, a golden ticket to Globetrot with Veggies Abroad. Veggies Abroad isn't just your go-to for vegan guides and trip planning tips. It's your passport to extraordinary small group journeys, carefully crafted by the ultimate veggie pusher and your favorite podcast host, me, Rebecca Gady-Sawicki. I've spent countless hours researching the best vegan hotels, food, and experiences, and now I'm bringing those experiences directly to you. Join me and my newfound veggie pals on escapades to exciting and exotic destinations around the world. Whether it's trekking through the Thai jungle to witness elephants in their natural habitat, or staying at a carbon-neutral camp in Kenya during the Great Migration, our adventures are nothing short of spectacular. And guess what? Those aren't the only exciting trips awaiting you. So what are you waiting for? Cruise on over to veggiesabroad.com pronto. Well, how about after this episode is over, to explore our dazzling lineup of trips and secure your spot on your next vegan adventure today. Yeah, and especially with this cafe, so a lot of them, we talked about drinking coffee. You could swim with the raccoon in this place.
Oh, yeah. Oh no!
I know.
So much more than when we first started talking about this. Oh my gosh!
I had forgotten completely about that part of it, and I think when I wrote, whatever I wrote about it, I was like, so you don't want kids peeing in the pool. What about raccoons peeing in the pool? Like,
yeah. Oh
you
my
can't
God.
control that, and then you're going to be swimming in raccoon pee, which can carry other things and which can make you sick. Disgusting. Yeah. Come on.
Disgusting. And I think we both read that article by the, ex-Owl Cafe employee. And I think in there too, that employee was talking about the back of house hygiene, where the same sink was being used to clean like owl pellet or, sift through some of the food and supplies they need for the owls as well as the cafe. So,
disgusting.
I think that cafe was actually reported to the Japanese health authority, which is a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it is no longer functioning. And so, in addition to all of these things, we also have issues with illegal wildlife trade and questionable supply chain issues and implications for biodiversity loss. It just keeps getting worse and worse. It's just, you just scratch the surface and then you go further and further and further. What is your take on all of that?
Yeah. So, this was actually one of the things I think, animal welfare is a big concern for me too, but I think as a biodiversity person, this was also another thing that was a bit jarring for me as well. And if you think about it, really, to supply these cafés, these animals have to come from somewhere. The exotic animal cafés in particular are very tight-lipped, or they make very vague statements about where they get their animals from. They'll say, oh, we adopt them. They don't really maybe specify that they're adopting them from the illegal wildlife trade, or, so they kind of use these very loose terms to make it sound like they're rescuing these animals or they're adopting them, but they are really contributing to the supply and the demand for these exotic animals on a wildlife market. And to be honest, I'm always kind of surprised that I think most people who visit these cafes don't just stop and question, why are there a dozen baby Asian small clawed otters in a cafe? Why are there capybaras in the UK when they're native to South? It's just kind of this, once you start thinking about it, it all starts unraveling of where do they get these animals? So I found generally, unless these cafes are operating with a more ethical approach where they are rescuing or rehabilitating these animals, they get them primarily likely from two areas. And one is breeding mills. So if you've heard of puppy mills, we now have those, for otters, pigs, capybaras, and more, and owls. And one of the reviews I read about there's this cafe called the Mi Pig Cafe in Japan. It is all across Japan. It's like MI Pig. And somebody left a review that they actually asked the staff, where do you get your pigs from? So there are, I guess, some people asking these questions, right? So they asked the staff, where do you get their pigs from? And the staff responded with, we just pick up the phone and we call and we say, we want a black and pink pig. Can you deliver one that looks like that? And a pig is delivered. So
that's crazy.
There's these, breeding mills that are happening in the background. We're laughing, I think, to keep from falling
crying. Yeah, absolutely. It's like Amazon for pigs now. What the hell?
Oh my gosh. I can only imagine, the inhumane conditions that probably are happening sometimes in the back of house at these cafes, how bad these breeding mills really are for these animals. And the other way to source animals would be through animal trafficking or trade. This can be legal or illegal. And I want to say that legal in some countries does not equal ethical. So even though a lot of these cafes say that they are getting their animals through legal means, that doesn't necessarily mean it is ethical or humane as how they are getting these animals. I watched one YouTube video by a welfare group. I'd have to look up their name again. Maybe we can link that or something. But I don't know if you actually want to watch this video, because it was kind of this behind the scenes look at what these trade markets look like. And this was one of the moments that I actually kind of had to take a break from this. There was just all types of animals in this big hall in these tiny cages that were being, traded and handled just like sacks of potatoes. And then I also looked at two different studies by animal biologists that were, both of these studies were published in the Society for Conservation Biology. And to kind of summarize their work, they also linked a lot of these cafes with housing endangered and threatened animals, including CITES, that's CITES, listed animals, the IUCN Red List endangered animals, and very commonly trafficked animals. So basically, these are animals that are subject to restrictions under international trade agreement and governing vulnerable animals. So 60% of the animals in Japan's cafes were identified as CITES listed. 50% of the species that they found in exotic animal cafes were listed as threatened by extinction from the IUCN. Some of the animals were actually taken from the wild, while most of them were captive bred in wildlife breeding schemes. 14% of the animals identified at Japan's animal cafes were wild caught animals. So they're actually taking them from the wild and putting them into these cafes. And in general, these cafes were linked in these studies with increased uptick in animal trafficking and the desire for exotic and wild pets at home. So they actually noticed as these cafes become more popular, there's actually import and export records. Generally, like the legal ones will have import and export records that are marked. And there was an increase in Japan's import for CITES listed animals kind of as these cafes become more prominent. And so all of these actions, especially like the wild caught animals, do have very real implications for wild animal populations, overall global biodiversity and planetary health. And that's not even, mentioning all the animal abuse that happens at those. That's just really looking at wild populations and animals.
Yeah, that I don't know that I really have words for all of that. It is tragic.
And I read this one article that was talking about there was a lot of gaps and gray areas in these import-export records. So there was some, kind of some dodgy stuff happening that, again, while these cafes say that they may be legal, there was some gaps and misreporting happening, it seemed like.
Jeez. Wow. Wow. So domestic animals, oftentimes we think are a little bit better. And we kind of talked about, your scale at the beginning of the for-profit model, the nonprofit model. There are domestic cafes that are nonprofit and for-profit.
Yeah.
So it's probably, they're not always necessarily a green flag, right?
Yeah, they're not. I would say, these are yellow flags that warrant a little bit of extra research. And I do think probably one of the most safe kind of separation is the nonprofit rescue versus a commercial for-profit. So pigs are actually a domesticated animal. And one of the most problematic cafes, I think, in Japan is that Meat Pig Cafe, because, they have stores all over Japan. So it's almost like this commercial. It's my cat in the background.
I know. He is chiming into this and also does not like it. It does not want to be a part of a cafe either.
No. So that's probably one of the more problematic kind of commercial corporatized models of cafes. So you really do need to look at like how they're operating as a business. So depending on how domestic animal cafes are managed, they can be some of the most ethical or some of the most problematic. I don't know if I need to let him in or not. But yeah, so, some questions to ask are they operating a nonprofit or are they operating more of like a commercial corporate business? Is it a cat or dog cafe? And I'm always be very wary of small domestic animals like ferrets, guinea pigs, because it's very unlikely this cafe is out rescuing ferrets off the street. They're probably involved in like you said, a pet store is a great example. They're really just kind of breeding these. And these are the ones that they say they adopt out to people. So it is kind of almost like a pet store where you're interacting with these ferrets and you can maybe even go home with a ferret. Like, do you know how to take care of a ferret? We don't know. But you feel free to go home with one,
Yeah, right. That's a whole nother problem.
So, is welfare for the animal and well-being put over your personal experience versus the animal? Yeah, so you're looking for animal experience over your own personal enjoyment. Do they have veterinary care for these animals? Are they keeping these animals, if they're not able to rehome, well into their senior years and providing the right care for them? And one of the things with domestic animals too, I'm always very careful of is breed-specific cafes. So again, we talked about that pet store experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some specific, I've not seen in person, but I've seen online some specific cat cafes for like specific breeds. Yeah. I saw that and I was like, what?
Yeah.
Why is this?
Yeah. And I even saw one in Japan. It was almost like a collection of breeds. So they were like, we have a husky, we have and it's like, they're kind of almost like going out and like cherry picking what they want to rescue or what they want to save. So anything that has like a diversity in age or breed is a little bit better as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think that you mentioned the nonprofit aspect of it, and asking all those questions really is helpful. Do you think most travelers realize their impact that a visit can have, or do you think that they're just completely ignorant to this?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this iceberg thing. So I think some travelers do, they do have this critical thinking, and they may not go to the cafe. Other travelers will go to the cafe and get a really bad feeling when they're there. I, read some reviews of people who left early or who just got a very, something in their gut was telling them that things were off. And then I've seen people kind of double down and say things looked fine. These animals seemed happy and healthy and well cared for. I think all of these are somewhat valid experiences in some way. But I think it helps to remember that even if you do go and you perceive this as to be a fine experience, the animals seem well cared for, you're just with this animal for 45 minutes of its entire life. So some of these cafes even kind of limit on the amount of time that you're in there. So that 45-minute experience could have been a great experience for you. The animal could have seemed fine. But what happens when the business closes for the day? Where do these animals go? Where do these animals come from? A lot of the animals at these cafes are baby animals. What happens when they become adults? So I think you're really just kind of seeing the surface level. And yeah, so I think there is kind of some level of people being aware and understanding what's going on. Some people really don't understand what's going on. But yeah, it kind of helps to put that into perspective of like the entirety of that iceberg that's going on underneath. Yeah. And I think another thing to point out too is most of us are not animal, especially exotic animal behavior specialists. And some of these animals, capybaras in particular, I was just looking at this capybara cafe that opened in the UK, and I was looking at their marketing page, and they were talking about how like capybaras are like so chill and they're the perfect animal for this like cafe. So you can come and sip coffee and these super chill animals are just relaxing around you. We don't actually know what yes, capybaras are very mild tempered, but unless we're actually testing their feces for increased levels of cortisol, we don't actually know if they're stressed or not, because they kind of exhibit these signs of silent stress. So a lot of these animals seem very mild mannered, but we don't actually really know how stressed they are. And I think as people, we are not equipped to like assess an animal's stress or like their behavioral patterns. And we oftentimes put these kind of like anthropogenic feelings on them. They seem happy, they seem fine, but we don't actually know what an otter's happiness is like unless it's out in the wild with their normal family kind of dynamics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is such an excellent point that we put on them what I think we want.
Yeah.
That want to think that they feel, but we absolutely have no idea how happy or sad an otter is, for heaven's sake.
I know. Like, yeah, those capybaras, I'm like, they were like, oh, they're so chill. They're perfect for this. And I'm like,
yeah. Did you hang out with a capybara in the savannah? Like, come on.
Are you, my comment is always like, oh, did you test their feces for increased levels of cortisol or not?
I mean, that's a really good response. When you were in Japan, I know that you left the Harajuku area pretty quickly, but did you visit any type of cafe, animal cafe?
I did not. And there are some ethical models of cafes in Japan. The Tokyo Weekender wrote a really good article that was, 7 cat cafes, and I looked through those and I got good vibes from all of those. I think at the end of the day, I just decided to kind of cut that experience out for myself. And when I was in Japan, I focused more on going to national parks and possibly seeing, animals in the wild. But I do think there are some good experiences that you can have. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for travelers that, want to still keep this kind of in their itinerary, but don't want to partake in something that's unethical, what are some red flags that they should look out for and some things that maybe then would lead them to something that's better?
Yeah. So, my immediate no-go is anything with an exotic or wild animal. And like I said, there are some of these like mixed animal cafes that can be a bit difficult. So, they will have hamsters and guinea pigs as well as an otter. So you can...
What a weird mix.
Right. Yeah. I actually was looking at a small animal cafe that were primarily domestic. The African pygmy hedgehog is a bit of a controversial if it's domesticated or not animal. But yeah, I was like, most of these are small, mostly domestic animals. And then I was looking through the photos and then there was an otter. So anything that has any type of exotic wild animal in it is an immediate no-go for me. And I also kind of group those small domestic animals into that group because I found, at least in Asia, the ones that I looked at, there was also an otter, along with it, or they're basically glorified pet stores. So anything with like small pets, exotic animals are kind of a no-go for me. And maybe some green flags to kind of look out for, because I think if you do find an ethical model, it can be the difference between a non-ethical model where you're supporting a wildlife trade versus an ethical model where you're saving rescue animals, you're supporting sick and stray animals. So it's like a really, really good thing or a really, really bad thing. So some of the green flags, a focus on domestic animals, primarily cats or dogs that aren't breed specific and aren't focused on just getting people in and out in this kind of like 45-minute turnstile thing. You want to look for cafes that have a clear vetted either adoption business model, or they're working with local NGOs to kind of keep, cats off the street or something like that. So those are great examples. And they will be transparent, and they'll be able to answer your questions beyond, we adopt them. We adopt them, and we have this really great vetting process, and we work with a local community partner. So you're kind of looking for a little bit more than these one statements that close you down. You also want to look for a cafe that will care for and shelter animals that are not adoptable, right? We talked about senior cats, aging out and still having a home there. So age diversity and breed diversity, ample space and enrichment. So cafes are providing, a spacious, stimulating environment with toys, climbing structures, other enriching items, transparency, for how they get their animals, and regular veterinary care is also really key. And there are some great kind of like farm sanctuaries as well that operate a cafe on site. So this is where you can go to a cafe and then learn about the farm animals that have been rescued. So there are some great domestic livestock experiences as well. And I have two friends, Jade and Matt. They run this thing called the Give Back Guide, and they have this great resource of some like vetted animal experiences around the world. I talked a little bit about Tokyo Weekender that vetted some cat cafes in Japan. And it can be really hard to sort through if you're in a foreign country and things are in a foreign language or communication barriers. So if you're on shore, start at home, make a little staycation out of it. Go find an ethical experience that you can more easily vet at home so you can get a good feel for what an ethical cafe looks like. And then as you travel, you can kind of take that feeling with you, and it gives you a little bit of experience to go off of.
Yeah, excellent ideas for sure. And do you think the biggest thing travelers can do to make a difference with this is not participate in these activities?
Yeah, I want to remind everybody that if you have been to a cafe, it's not, you're not a terrible person. And so be kind to yourself if you did visit a cafe. The best outcome is kind of developing the critical thinking skills, and I think listening to your gut and not going to them. But if you did, right, you're not a terrible person. And I think most of the people that are visiting these cafes are like ultimate animal lovers, that they just want to be close to them and, touch and experience them. So just, kind of decenter yourself and realize that 45 minutes of your personal enjoyment is a lifetime of cruelty for some of these animals. And there's a petition that you can sign. Maybe we can find a way to give readers that. There's a change petition to actually shut some of these animal cafes down. Be very careful when you're booking prepackaged tours on like Get Your Guide or Viator. Always read the fine print, because even like a walking tour of Harajuku may take you into one of these cafes. But if you just think like, oh, I'm doing a walking tour, this is fine. I talked to a lot of travelers in Japan that they ended up on these tours, and then the tour took them to an animal cafe, or I'm friends with a lot of vegetarians and vegans. They ended up doing, like a snake liquor tasting or something. So read the fine print in these experiences so you really know what you're getting into. Start conversations, I think. So if a hotel suggests a non-ethical animal experience, a lot of times in Japan, I would be like, hey, what's a local thing to do? And they would tell me to go to an animal cafe. Start a conversation as to why that's not something you're interested in doing, but be very respectful about it. Some of these cafes will offer discounts for a 5-star review. If you went to one and you got a really bad feeling, do not feel pressured to give them a 5-star review. Some of the most helpful reviews from travelers were the very honest ones, the 1-star reviews that really provided, I think, an insight into some of the situations. So that's one of the most helpful things you can do. Just be honest, transparent, start a conversation, and don't engage in social media on these, think, why is this person interacting with an otter? Like, sure, it's cute, but and I'm convinced that these models are spreading, around because of social media in a way that, the United States or the UK or whoever, like, oh, people seem to really like these capybara cafes. Let's open one here. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent point. Yeah, I think for sure people see all of these things, the lady feeding the raccoon outside or
Yeah.
the swimming with the raccoon, like all of these things, like you're seeing this and thinking like, oh, well, I saw it on Instagram. Like, why
Yeah.
isn't it a great idea to do?
These
I
animals
think,
were very cute, and they
are.
Yeah.
1,000%. We need the opposite of it, of talking about like, hey, no, do you really want some weird ringworm?
No.
No, you don't. So don't go and swim with it.
Yeah.
You don't want
raccoons.
yeah, like come on, guys. Like, some very good critical thinking with that, sharing the realities of it as well.
Yeah.
Social media tires me out.
I think the good thing is there is some change happening. So as these models are spreading, I did notice a little bit of maybe a turning point in some countries in Asia. So I will say that I think the situation with animal cafes in Korea was also very problematic and jarring. So I noticed some really problematic cafes as I was doing this research in Korea, but I think it actually got so bad that Korea is now passing some laws for animal welfare that I think are really transformational for their country. So they just passed, I think, a law that only allows zoos to keep exotic animals rather than cafes. And there's a lot of loopholes maybe as to what could be defined as a zoo, but it is progress. And some of these articles or, research papers that I was writing, they're coming from like Japanese universities. And so I think there is this growing body of research within Japan that is highlighting how unethical these cafes are, how bad they are for, disease transmission and wildlife populations. And I think there is a little bit of a growing body of awareness. And so by speaking out and kind of supporting this transition, I'm hoping that we're kind of at this turning point where we stop to see this growth and a little bit of a decline. This is something I just thought of, which I don't know, but it's so hard to kind of transition away from these models too, because they have been so built up. There is this entire industry now that relies on these cafes and these wildlife trades, and cutting them off cold turkey is so difficult because now you have thousands of animals in this warehouse that are probably going to be euthanized, right? So the best way to do is just stop supporting them, really having these critical thinking skills, go support the ethical ones, and hopefully we can kind of like wean ourselves off of this extractive model.
Yes. Excellent point. That is a great place to leave everybody. Thank you again, Sooz. This was an excellent conversation, and I hope very helpful for all of the travelers out there listening.
Yeah, I hope it was enlightening. And yeah, hopefully you all find an ethical cafe that you're able to support and in their efforts.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. If you'd also like to learn more about upcoming Veggies Abroad tours or get additional travel help, visit veggiesabroad.com and also join our newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date with loads of new content, like where to find gorgeous vegan hotels, what to eat in cities around the world, trip planning tips, and so much more. Well, that's all I've got for now. Until next time.